오늘 영상은 영국 에든버러 대학교에서 진행한 한국학 인터뷰입니다. 한국학, 말 그대로 한국을 따로 배우는 학문인데요. 이 학교에선 한국어만 가르치는 게 아니었습니다. 한국이 지나온 시간과 지금의 한국, 그리고 한반도를 둘러싼 이야기까지 수업 안에 들어가 있었습니다. 시청자 여러분들도 조금 의아하실 겁니다. 영국 대학에서 대체 한국을 왜 이렇게 따로 배우고 있을까요?
Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer Miller and I am a PhD student in Korean Studies at the University of Edinburgh, who is a lecturer in Japanese and Korean Studies here at Edinburgh. Dr. Stevens received her PhD in History from the University of Pennsylvania in 2017, and her research interests include economic history, agriculture, empire, everyday life, village organisations, and the emergence of the modern state. She's currently working on a monograph project. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
No, that's great. So first question, as I just said, you completed your PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. But I wondered if you could maybe provide a broader overview of your education and career path, particularly how you became interested in Korean studies and why you chose to pursue a doctorate in history in particular.
Yeah, so sure. So I guess, well, the secret, which is not really a secret if I'm going to share it on the video here, is that I hated history as a teenager. I didn't even study it for GCSE. So my path into Korean history, it came from the language side. I did my undergraduate degree in Japanese studies, and then I enjoyed that. So I did a master's in Korean studies to try and complement that. And it was while I was doing the master's that I realized that a lot of different things happened in modern Korean history. And so I became really interested in the question of how we untangle some of the experiences of empire, of industrialization, urbanization, war, authoritarian rule, and democratization. I just wanted to know, or to try and understand how and why people have understood some of the connections between these, big scale events, as well as the stories that people tell themselves to try and make sense of their own lives amongst all of these changes. And it turns out that that is history, trying to understand how and why things change. So I accepted my fate and I went and did the PhD. But yeah, that's one of the things that I try to encourage students to recognize in teaching the undergrads, especially on our compulsory history classes. I know it can seem dry and dusty from personal experience. I've been there, but I really want to hope that, yeah, I can get students to recognize and get interested in some of these bigger questions.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think it also shows the importance of keeping quite an
오히려 어릴 때는 역사를 좋아하지 않았다고 합니다. 그런데 언어 공부를 하다가 한국사를 만나게 됩니다. 한국을 따라가다 보니 제국의 시대가 나오고 전쟁이 나오고 산업화와 민주화까지 한꺼번에 나왔던 것이죠. 외국 학생 입장에선 당황스러웠을 겁니다. 한국 하나 보려 했는데 근현대사의 큰 장면들이 계속 따라 나왔으니까요.
two postgraduate modules, Korean History, Culture and Society and the Political Economy course. So in your view, why are these subjects, and I guess particularly political economy, why are they so important for Korean studies students to understand?
잠시만요. 소개되는 과목들을 보면 생각보다 많습니다.
Yeah, so these classes, I mean, I teach both of them, and obviously they have their own distinct emphases. But you may recall from taking the classes, it's almost impossible to fully separate the two. So in my history classes, I end up talking a lot about the economy, and vice versa in the political economy class. I try to bring in this historical perspective a little bit. And that's partly because economic development, it has been such a major issue in the post-war history of both North and South Korea alike. There's this major emphasis on state planning, trying to develop and compete economically between the two Koreas. And so from a historical perspective, we can't ignore the influence of industrialization or economic development, even if we're interested in, different topics like culture or religion or gender, still comes back to, or we can still trace the influence of, some of the political emphasis on economic development through these different fields. And recognizing that, I think, leads us to think, find some very interesting connections and influences within these different fields as well. So I try to open that avenue for students. But in terms of the political economy side, it's important to think about Korea, or to recognize this within Korea as well, because Korea is just this wonderful test case for some of these theories of political economy. Like one of the big jobs of economists and political scientists and social sciences, it is to try and, develop these theories to understand the world. But we also then need to think critically about these theories, understand where they're coming from and why they take on, some of these different emphases at different moments in time. And Korea, less so these days. More political scientists and social scientists are, paying a lot of attention to Korea. However, historically, Korea didn't always receive the most attention in some of this, political and economic theorizing. And so it's a really good example to compare these theories, to get this theoretically informed case and see, how does this compare to what actually happened in Korea, and then that not only tells us, information about Korea, but it also helps us learn more about these theories and these ways of understanding development. We can see when and why they diverge. That tells us a lot about our own assumptions about the world as much as it does about Korea.
한국을 알면 한국만 알게 되는 게 아니라는 교수님. 경제 발전을 설명할 때도 한국이 나오고 세상을 보는 이론을 다시 생각할 때도 한국이 나온다는 것이죠. 이어 다른 교수님이 등장하는데요. 이분은 한국의 중립화에 많은 관심을 두고 있었습니다. 한국이 중립화하면 세계 정세의 모습이 많이 달라졌을 거라는 주장이었는데요.
Neutralization of Korea from 1882 to 1907. And why this periodization? This is because I deliberately chose this period where neutralization proposals were suggested, funnily enough, first by Japan, but later on it was picked up by both Koreans and Europeans and alike, and others. And why it stopped in 1907? Well, that's because the Gojong, Korean emperor, he sent a special delegation to The Hague, which was held in 1907, and delegates from around the world met in Hague to discuss, among other things, disarmament and issues pertaining to international relations. So Gojong at that time thought that this was perhaps very useful opportunity to sue for major powers' interest in Korean independence. And although my book does focus on neutralization, it also deals with Korea's bilateral ties with major powers, in this case, China, Japan, Russia, Britain, US, and to a less extent, France and Germany. Now, China, of course, during this period was not considered global power. However, from the perspective of Joseon Korea, because Joseon Korea maintained centuries of tributary relations with Qing China, Qing China, at least from the East Asian perspective, was still considered a major power, at least until it was defeated by Japan in the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So that's why I devoted a considerable time in, for example, dissecting relations with Joseon Korea and China. And it also, apart from the discussing Korea's ties with these countries, because my book is divided into three hegemonic rivalries, firstly Sino-Japanese, briefly Anglo-Russian during Britain's occupation of Gomundo from 1885 to 87, and later on Russo-Japanese rivalry, all the way up to the Russo-Japanese War. So and because neutralization was affected by different influencing factors. So, for example, we have military strength, loans, infrastructure such as railways, telegraph lines, factional conflicts, and others. So even for those who have no interest in or little interest in Korean neutralization, they can still use my book as a guide to understand how peripheral state, in this case Korea, strive to maintain its admittedly very fragile sovereignty in the age of high imperialism. And so for that reason, I think my book can be a good comparative study for those who are doing imperial history or who want to understand relationship between periphery and core states and how core states strive to maintain balance of power in this very important geopolitical hotspot Korean peninsula during this period.
이번엔 주변 나라들 이름이 쉴 새 없이 나옵니다. 중국과 일본, 러시아와 영국, 그리고 미국까지 그 사이에 조선이 있었습니다.
And you mentioned briefly how neutralization has resurfaced as possible option, and that's true. In fact, at the height of the another North Korean crisis of a couple of years ago, on the early years of President Trump's presidency, there was interesting commentary published by the then Harvard professor and also ex-British Foreign Office diplomat Roderick McParcour. And in that commentary, he argued that perhaps suggesting to China permanent neutralization of the Korean Peninsula can be a good option by the US to denuclearize North Korea, but also to even bring about the end of the North Korean regime. And he suggested neutralization because he realized that China justifiably be very worried if, let's say, unified Korea still hosts US military presence. Imagine, for example, Mexico or Canada decides to host Chinese military base. And we know how the US reacted to Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. So we have to, so in delicate matters like this, I think we need to know how to maintain balanced perspective. It's not black and white. It's not about, okay, one country wins, the other country must lose. And I think we have already entered, in my view, China-US bipolarity, not just in Asia-Pacific region, but increasingly around the world. And there have been scholars who have been saying that we are living in bipolarity. And I should also mention that this neutralization of Korea was also suggested by former Singaporean diplomats.
분명 오래전 이야기인데 듣다 보면 오늘날과 비슷한 부분들도 많았습니다. 한국이 어디에 서야 하는지, 주변 나라들이 한국을 어떻게 바라보는지, 이 질문은 아직도 끝난 적이 없으니 말이죠. 이번엔 나라 이야기에서 사람들의 기록으로 넘어갑니다.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, that wasn't ever really a conscious decision. I knew I wanted to get as much local detail to try and contrast with documents produced by the central government during the colonial period. So I knew I was interested in agriculture because that was, like, the main occupation of the majority of the population throughout colonial rule. So I wanted to see, what changes are taking place. And a lot of the documents during that period are produced by the colonial government. But I mean, there's always a gap between, central government high-level plans and then, what actually happens between like lower levels of administration or just activity, day-to-day life. But this is especially, a concern when we're thinking about the colonial period, where these, planners in Tokyo and Seoul, like, they don't necessarily even have the language to talk to Koreans, let alone consider what they're thinking. And so I really wanted to try and find, just local history sources that might try and capture a bit of that gap. So when I went to Korea to do my fieldwork, I basically visited a lot of professors working on local history within South Korea. So I visited Hamhani, Heo Young-nan, Kim Pil-dong, Woo Dae-hyung, Kim Hyun-suk, Lee Kyung-nan. These professors, they were very generous with their time, just explaining to me about their research, because a lot of these guys, they're engaged in, developing some of their own archives of local history, as well as, doing their own research as well. So sometimes they were even generous enough to share some of their sources with me. And so that was really helpful, hearing about how they've been approaching it, their experience with it. When they failed to find the documents that I was looking for, that really saved me a lot of time, knowing that, these professors who have so much more experience, they saved me a lot of time. Ultimately, I didn't find the initial set of documents that I was looking for. I wanted to find the documents from the financial associations, so the Kumyungtohap or the Kinyu Kumiai. I was unable to find those, but I was fortunate in that a lot of several of the big Korean Studies institutes, like the National Institute of Korean History and the Academy of Korean Studies, for example, there's been this real effort on their part to publish diaries, to collect and publish diaries that were written. And so I was able to access farmers' diaries through these institutions that, weren't available even 10, 20 years ago. And so, yeah, that was really fortunate, and it's also really exciting because I think, well, I hope, I'm certainly not going to be the only one working on these. I hope that we are going to see a lot more interest in this local history, microhistory, history of everyday life.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what you said initially also illustrates how important it is to build academic networks, even from sort of the level of a postgrad student, a PhD student, just building these networks can actually really help along the way in terms of developing a methodology, sources. So that's something I think that's important for anybody watching this video
Yes.
to bear in mind from the outset.
Yeah. And also plan into your research that, things may not go to plan. You may, have the best intention in the world to find some financial association documents, but if they don't exist, you find the next best thing. And ultimately it worked out better that I found these diaries because the financial associations are still relatively formal. These diaries, they're written by the people themselves. They're very personal documents.
Yeah.
So it's better than I could have imagined when I was writing up my research proposal.
Yeah, no, for sure, no, definitely. And I guess kind of linked to that in terms of maybe skills to have and
그런데 여기서 농민 일기가 나옵니다. 그 시대 사람들이 무엇을 보고 살았는지, 무엇을 걱정했는지, 하루를 어떻게 남겼는지 보는 것이었죠. 결국 한국 사람들이 직접 남긴 글을 따라가게 된 겁니다.
I've ever finished a meeting without giving students like multiple recommendations to read. But I guess the real piece of advice, and it comes back to what you were saying earlier about networks. I mean, obviously Edinburgh is a great place to study Korean studies, and it's a wonderful place to live. And I like to think that we have a really good department here. However, I guess, don't only think about Edinburgh. Think about the broader community of Korean studies out there. Because, I mean, Asian studies tends to be a smaller discipline within the UK, and Korean studies within that is all the smaller. And one of the benefits of that, being so small, I find is that there's a lot of activity and networks and a lot of, research communities that people are very happy to, build and interact with one another, even if we're not in the same place. So there's, like AXA, the Association for Korean Studies in Europe. There's the Social Science Korea Network that Youngmi Kim is involved in. And of course, connections to and with scholars in Korea and the Korean institutes. I would say, if you want to study Korean studies at Edinburgh, that's wonderful. But I hope that we would help you to also, go out into that wider world and take full advantage of the Korean studies community.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. And I think it's also probably worth mentioning that there's so much that we have here at Edinburgh. You mentioned that you've taught on a number of those. Are there any subjects that you particularly really enjoy teaching? And I guess the other thing is that in Scotland, as far as I'm aware, there isn't an undergraduate degree in Korean studies. So, there's possibly students that are interested in studying the Masters in Korean Studies that might not have a background in that field. I didn't personally before I started. So when students are choosing elective modules, what would you advise them to consider?
For those who don't speak Korean or possess very limited knowledge of Korean, they should take our modules in Korean language. It's taught by native expert Korean language instructor. And I would also advise that they take courses on modern East Asian history course, which covers basically Japan and Korea and some about China as well. They can also take courses on politics and international relations of East Asia, because this course will equip them ability to contextualize Korean Peninsula and its neighbors in cross-disciplinary and regional perspectives. I think another course that I think many students may find interesting is exploring contemporary Korea through films and dramas. So I realized that maybe not all, but significant minority of students who are interested in Korea or Korean courses have at least some interest in maybe in Korean cinema or Korean drama or K-pop. I mean, I don't blame them. I also like BTS, for example, and so that course will be interesting because students will be able to watch their favorite dramas or movies, and then each week they can discuss their with classmates and the instructor about their impressions on, say, class society in South Korea or other social issues that you can detect by watching Korean dramas and films. And I guess one of the good aspects of that course is that students were allowed to choose different assignments. So they did not have to write essays for midterm. So they could choose, for example, make video essays, policy briefs, and others. And I think that's one of the major strengths of courses at Edinburgh, Korea-related courses, because students can complete what I guess what you call non-traditional university assignments, because traditionally when we think about university assignment, we think about essays or literature reviews, which you can do, but at Edinburgh, if you take Korea-related courses, you can also do video essays, policy briefs, and other types of assignments, which I think is not very common in other Korean studies courses in Britain. Yeah.
오늘 인터뷰에선 영국의 대학교에서 한국학을 어떻게 배우고 있는지 조금이나마 알 수 있었습니다. 그저 질문하고 답하는 인터뷰였지만 내용은 결코 가볍지 않았는데요. 한국어를 배우는 학생들부터 한국의 역사와 경제, 또 한국 영화와 드라마를 수업 안에서 다루는 모습까지 볼 수 있었습니다. 우리 한국인에겐 너무 익숙한 것들이라 대수롭지 않게 느껴질 수도 있습니다. 하지만 외국 대학에선 그것을 하나씩 꺼내 배우고 연구하고 있었습니다. 한국이 지나온 역사와 오늘날 우리의 문화까지 그 모든 것이 한국을 이해하기 위한 중요한 공부가 되고 있었던 것이죠. 시청자 여러분들은 오늘 인터뷰를 어떻게 보셨나요? 오늘 강의는 여기까지입니다. 시청해주셔서 정말 감사합니다. 함께해주신 교수님들 감사합니다.